Das nächste Thema dreht sich um Journalismus, der langsam verschwindet. Wir sind in den USA und in den USA hat die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung für die Zeitungen in den letzten Jahren dramatische Züge angenommen. Schon vor Corona sind hunderte Zeitungen verschwunden. Mit Corona, Stand heute, sind es um die 2000, die seit 2004 nicht mehr existieren. Ohne Journalismus vor Ort haben Fake News einen sehr fruchtbaren Boden. Um das und andere wirklich gravierende Folgen für die Gemeinden in den USA zu verhindern, gibt es das American Journalism Project. Es hat einen sehr speziellen Finanzierungsansatz und Matthias Döpfner spricht jetzt mit der CEO des American Journalism Project, Sarabeth Berman, und fragt und schaut, ob das für Deutschland und Europa eigentlich auch ein Modell sein könnte oder auch nicht.
Hello, it's my pleasure to talk to Sarabeth Berman, the CEO of the American Journalism Project. Sarabeth, great talking to you, and please tell the crowd what the American Journalism Project is about.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really delighted, though I wish that I was on a plane and seeing you all in person, but happy to be here via Skype. So I lead an organization called the American Journalism Project. We are very, very concerned about the crisis in local news in our country. We think it's having incredibly insidious implications on the functioning of our democracy. And so we've created what we call a venture philanthropy fund to invest in the future of local news by seeding and helping to build new digital first enterprises that really have a fundamentally different business model than the historic business model for local news. These are nonprofit organizations that are funded through very diversified revenue, but including, and very importantly, philanthropy.
Sarabeth, it is one of the very few cases where it seems that Germany is doing better than the United States. In Germany, regional newspapers, local newspapers are still doing well. I mean, of course, we have the same structural changes. We have the same headwinds. We have the transformation from analog to digital. But nevertheless, there's still a big diversity of independent publishers. Most of them are still making a lot of money. And we have even seen during the COVID pandemic growth in circulation revenues, in advertising revenues. So it is an industry that has its challenges, but it is not the object of philanthropy. Whereas in America, I think if the numbers are correct, since 2004, 1,800 newspapers died. And during the last 10 years, the number of journalists in newspaper newsrooms went down by 47%. That is shocking. Now, what is your analysis? Why are the American regional and local newspapers suffering so much? Is it a structural thing that it used to be different before the digital transformation started? Or is it just because this whole transformation is so much faster and more radical in the United States? What's your take on that?
Yeah, the dynamics that you have described are really troubling. We have basically been in a slow motion crisis over the last decade and a half. You mentioned the 1,800 communities that we now call news deserts. These are literally communities that have no local news, which means communities have no idea what is going on in their surroundings. And I think the dynamics really are forces that are playing out all over the country, but have been magnified in the United States. We think this is a market failure. For 150 years in the United States, we relied basically entirely on advertising revenue to support local news. Our local newspapers were essentially 80% advertising, 20% subscriptions. The advertising revenue has all but dried up. It has moved largely, and this dynamic I know is true in Germany as well, but has moved largely to the platforms. And subscription revenue has, in some cases, increased, but largely it has declined as well. And we never really relied on subscriptions to fund our local news. The big national papers like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, have been able to capture the scale of the internet and have been able to fund their organization's transformations through the mass audience that comes with having national and local scale. But local community papers just simply don't have the scale to be able to provide what we've come to understand really as a public good. There's been consolidation of our newspaper chains. And so now our daily circulation of the more than 50% of the daily circulation newspapers in our country are owned by hedge funds. So there's been massive consolidation. And their incentives are really to drive as high margins as possible. Their incentives are not journalism. So they've been laying off reporters. Yeah, go ahead.
No, Sarabeth, you have just touched upon a very fundamental structural difference, because you rightly alluded to the fact that American newspapers were almost completely based on the revenues coming from advertising, whereas the subscription and circulation is in most of the cases almost, you could say, subsidized. So there's so much marketing investments in order to get circulation up or keep subscriptions up that it is almost an unprofitable element of the business model. And that is structurally very different in Germany. In Germany, subscription is very important, is very profitable. There are even extreme examples where a newspaper would make money without one single ad, because the subscription revenues are so important. If we learn something from that structural difference that now in a way puts a lot of American local papers into trouble, what should we then learn for the digital version of a local newspaper, for digital journalism in general? I would say that it needs to be based on subscription revenues, because that is just a more profound and a more solid business model. Do you see any examples where local newspapers are starting to make money, to develop really an alternative in the digital space based on subscription?
We have come to think that reader revenue is essential, but it does not necessarily need to be subscriptions. We think that the most promising way to fund local news is going to be to call upon readers to become members. We call it membership, to pay for the news, but not to put it behind a paywall. And there really is not strong evidence at the local level that subscriptions drive more revenue than just calling upon readers to say, you care about this, you are using this, donate. We've had a long tradition of this in our public radio. We run membership campaigns frequently for public radio where people get on the radio and say, please call this number, donate today, and it's worked. And we think that needs to be a really important revenue model going forward. We also think, and this is a structural difference from Germany, that philanthropy needs to play a very big role. And this is largely because we have a tax structure that really incentivizes philanthropy. We have a very robust philanthropic community. And we also have rising wealth. There are a lot of people who are becoming enormously wealthy in our society and have a lot of money to give away. And we think that those people, and we are seeing more and more of them, really do need to be stepping up and funding these enterprises to subsidize the reporting, which is expensive. And many of these communities are quite small. Like, just asking the readers to pay for it really isn't enough. We need to find other sources of revenue, and it's what led us to think that philanthropy, we need to think of these much more as cultural institutions, civic institutions, that people are supporting in the same way that they've supported the opera or the ballet.
But Sarabeth, what is your long-term approach here? Is it basically that you think local journalism is going to be based on philanthropy, on donations in the long term, or would you say the initiative of the American Journalism Project is mainly to help publishers in their transition phase to successfully digitize. In that phase, in a way, also help them with philanthropic donations, but with that also provide a basis for a long-term business model in the digital future. What is your approach? Is it a long-term thing, or is it more a transition help?
I would say it's both. So one is, we think philanthropy has an urgent role right now to bridge this transition. We also think over the long term, local funders should be paying more to ensure that their community is informed, and that philanthropy should play a decreasing but ever sustaining role in helping to support local journalism. One thing that is very different about the United States from Germany is we spend a lot fewer tax dollars on journalism than you all do. And so we don't have public dollars going into local journalism. And so that is another long-term play here. We need more public dollars supporting this public good. And philanthropy, often at its best, is a bridge to a public policy solution. So over the long term, I think public dollars also needs to play an important role here.
Sarabeth, what is your personal intrinsic motivation to do that job? Why is local journalism so important to you?
This really is very important to me personally, is the data is extremely clear that local news is contributing to polarization in our country. When communities that have lost a local paper are less likely to split their ticket when they vote, meaning they are literally becoming, we are polarizing our local politics. So, you know, where it used to be that you would vote on the issues, you would vote on the candidates, we now just vote on party lines. And what it's done is really nationalized our local issues. You are in New Hampshire and you hear people very concerned about border issues, which are thousands and thousands of miles away from them. You know, the Mexican border is very far from New Hampshire. And it's because what's filled the void is national media, which is very polarized and talking about national issues, and social media, which algorithms are engineered to proliferate misinformation. And instead of really connecting along the local issues that actually affect people's day-to-day lives and really matter to how they're going to live their lives and how they should be engaging in their community. So I just think this issue is really at the heart of many of the kind of fundamental structural issues that the United States is facing right now.
Listening to you, it seems not to be too much of an exaggeration to say local news are an essential facility for democracy. Would you agree?
I 100% agree.
Sarabeth, thank you so much. That was really inspiring.
Really great to talk to you. We need to learn from you all and understand why it is that it's working so much better where you are.
Yeah, let's start a transatlantic exchange. That would be wonderful.